The Department of Justice is investigating the collapse of Silicon Valley Bank. Federal law enforcement officials tell CBS News the review is in its early stages. The Wall Street Journal reports that the Securities and Exchange Commission is also looking into it. Then there's the politics. House Republicans held a call last night to discuss their response. And today, House Speaker Kevin McCarthy put the blame on the Biden administration. He tweeted, quote, Biden's reckless spending caused record inflation and rapid interest rate hikes that broke family budgets and banks, too. So for more on this, let's bring in Ed O'Keefe and Scott MacFarlane. Scott is CBS News congressional correspondent with us from Capitol Hill, and CBS News' Ed O'Keefe is senior White House correspondent and political correspondent from California, joining us where the president is traveling today. Thank you both for being here. Scott, I want to start with you. I want to play a little bit of sound from some of the Republican lawmakers who are on some key committees dealing with this issue.
They're trying to send the message that your bank accounts are safe in America, so there's no need to move money from one bank to another based off some social media feed or some report. That's a clear message they're sending.
Calls for more regulation on regional banks and putting more pressure on regional banks with more rules and regulations is not the answer.
What is relevant is risky management practices with or without Dodd-Frank and lack of supervision by the primary regulator.
So, Scott, you've been on Capitol Hill all day talking to lawmakers. What are the next steps? Are you seeing any calls for action on a legislative response?
A few moments ago, just heard back from the House Majority Leader's office, who says there are no plans to bring Congress back, the U.S. House back, any sooner to tackle these bank failures and any legislation that may be needed because of these bank failures. So there's no urgency in that sense. And we've been kind of feeling around in the dark for any indication, any light that shows a possible bipartisan legislative effort in the works, and we are finding nothing right now. This is happening at a politically toxic moment. There is no indication of a meeting of the minds between the two parties as to a road ahead. But here are the proposals we're hearing from any number of Democrats: raising the insurance level through which the FDIC can insure losses in the case of a bank failure. Republicans talking about possible changes to regulations, but not a rollback of those 2018 changes that many Democrats blame these failures on. But we can be certain of one thing. There will be hearings on both sides of the U.S. Capitol. Democrats in the Senate are going to call for it. Republicans in the House are going to call for it. There will be robust investigations, but there's no trajectory towards a legislative change because of this.
Yeah, I think a lot of people will be very interested in who they bring in front of them for those hearings. I mean, Ed, to you've heard Republicans are trying to pin this on the White House. What is the White House saying in response to this argument that they're making? And is there any indication of any further steps the administration could take, or are they calling on action from Congress?
They're mostly leaving this to the Treasury Department and the related bank regulators to ensure that there aren't any more banks like SVB and Signature Bank out there, and hoping that they can catch this before it happens again. Remember, also, FDIC is trying to auction off parts of SVB to other private companies to see if they're interested in buying up the leftover pieces. That would be one way to make this go away. The hope is that this was contained to just these two smaller regional banks and not part of a wider collapse of the regional or smaller banking sector. And as it comes to legislation, they're probably going to leave that for now, at least to Democrats and Republicans to squabble over. If they can't sort out any other issue, should we believe that this is one that they can suddenly sort out? So we'll see. There's no immediate call for some kind of legislative fix from the White House just yet. But we know the president was expressing concern over the weekend that the banks themselves or their investors would somehow get relief in this situation. And you saw him lay out when he spoke about this Monday that it's really just the customers, the depositors, that he's concerned about helping, that if something else happened to the investors and those in charge of these failed banks, well, that's just capitalism running its course. So we'll see. But certainly, this is a White House that has been concerned about, sensitive to the health of the economy and anything that gets in the way of that. Inflation easing today with the consumer price index coming about 6% is something they're encouraged by. And, we'll see again in the coming days whether there's any other bank out there that could potentially be affected in this way. And if not, this may mostly become an academic exercise up on Capitol Hill.
Yeah, I mean, Scott, speaking of that squabbling, that political squabbling that Ed was talking about, I mean, it was interesting that you're not really hearing Republicans object to the actions taken by the administration and Treasury. So kind of walk us through the politics here. How are they advancing their respective arguments?
We've heard some criticism of the Federal Reserve in California, perhaps steps it could have taken to ward off the failure at Silicon Valley. Let's put that aside. What's jumping out at me over the past 24 hours is the number of members of Congress from both parties who are issuing these statements, trying to reassure their own constituents that it is safe to put their money in a community bank, that the banking system as a whole is safe, almost serving like a cheerleader or a morale coach for the country at this moment in time, especially those who represent more rural areas where there are more smaller community banks. Joe Manchin did this in West Virginia. Barry Loudermilk, the Republican, did this in Georgia. Let's put that aside for a moment also. There's this hope, if not this aspiration, Caitlin, that this will not bear any resemblance to 2008 and the economic calamity and the bank calamity of 2008. Maybe that's a hope, maybe that's an aspiration, but we can say one thing without equivocation. There are only a few dozen members of Congress who were still here from 2008. There aren't hundreds. There are just dozens. There's been such turnover in Congress in the wave elections of 2010, 2018. And that leaves a little less experience with this type of issue than Congress might have had if it happened 5 or 10 years ago. So some members of Congress will be learning on the fly how Congress is supposed to respond to a massive bank failure.
Yeah, that's a really good point about a lot of constituents, no matter what party you belong to, are concerned about their own personal finances and what this means for them. And I want to switch gears a little bit and go to where you are in California, because that's where the president is. He just spoke or is currently speaking in Monterey Park, and he announced a new executive order on guns. What exactly does that entail?
Yeah, he's here in Monterey Park, where, of course, there was a shooting in January at this ballroom behind us, now shuttered ballroom. Remember, 11 people were killed, 9 injured in those shootings just off of Lunar New Year celebrations in this predominantly Asian community. The president here today, as he signs an executive order that is designed to ensure that elements of the legislation passed last summer in bipartisan fashion regarding gun restrictions is actually enacted, telling the Justice Department, work to ensure that every background check that has to happen before a gun sale can actually happen, and trying to close loopholes and sort of better define what exactly is now considered a gun purchase. There are those that are done at licensed firearm dealerships. There are those that are done at gun shows. But what about the guy who maybe is selling one off, an antique or a hobby weapon to somebody? Ensuring that those purchases are also subject to a background check as subject to the law that was passed last year. And then also encouraging the entire federal government, in essence, from the Pentagon to the VA, the Department of Health and Human Services and Homeland Security, to do what it can, the various ways it talks to the public, raising concerns about safe storage of firearms, about the potential theft of them while they're being shipped, and also encouraging a better understanding of red flag laws that are in about 19 states in the District of Columbia, those laws that allow somebody to go to a judge and say, I believe this person may be a threat to themselves. We need to make sure that they don't have access to a firearm, at least temporarily, so that they don't harm themselves or others. Of course, he's doing this in a state that has some of the strictest gun laws already, and after a situation where a background check wouldn't have necessarily made things any easier because the man who's alleged to have done this shooting had owned the weapon since the late 1990s. So it wasn't an example of somebody perhaps getting one illegally and then going and using it in a violent way. We should also point out, Caitlin, I've been stunned by this stat all day long, and I want to share it again here. What are we at now? About 117 mass shootings, 110 mass shootings so far this year, 77 of them since this shooting here in January.
Wow, Ed, and unfortunately not the first time the president has had to visit the site of a mass shooting in his term so far. Ed O'Keefe and Scott MacFarlane, as always, thank you so much for your reporting.